The first light of dawn slipped like a silent messenger over the red cliffs of Red Rock, painting the jagged mesas in hues of rose and gold. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and distant thunder, though no storm gathered. The land itself seemed to whisper of coming change. Down below, the town of Bitter Ridge lay half asleep, its wooden buildings flickering with the promise of another ordinary day. Lenora Sinclair stood at the edge of her modest homestead, gazing out at the horizon, with eyes the color of storm clouds. The years had etched lines around her mouth and deepened the silver in her hair, but her posture remained unwavering, rooted and strong like the juniper that clung to the canyon walls. She breathed in the chill morning air, recalling the first time she'd set foot here, a wide-eyed girl chasing her father's wagon across the prairie. This land had shaped her. Its harshness had forged her resolve. Its solitude taught her self-reliance out behind her. The small clapboard house stood silent, its windows shuttered against the cool breeze. Inside, a single blanket-covered figure stirred. Lenora's heart tightened at the thought of the injured stranger, whose life now depended on her mercy. She'd found him 2 nights ago, lying half-buried in the sand of the arroyo, his tawny skin streaked with blood, arrow wounds staining his tunic. By his side, the pawprints of wolves and the faint tracks of riders told a tale of desperation and a debt owed by a warrior of the Pawnee. Lenora nudged the door open. The creak of its hinges seemed an apology to the sleeping world. Inside, the warrior lay on a makeshift cot, dark eyes closed, chest rising in a slow, measured rhythm. His braided hair, still tangled with grit, framed a face carved by scar tissue and endurance. She placed a basin of water on the rough-hewn table, the sound of the water like a promise of healing. Her thoughts drifted to the stories her mother had told her of the Pawnee, proud horsemen whose loyalty ran deeper than the rivers that cut through the plains. She remembered the warning: one who saves a warrior invites both honor and danger in equal measure. She had shrugged off that caution when she found him, and now the dawn chorus of coyotes seemed to echo the worry in her chest. Lenora knelt by the cot, her fingers gentle as she dampened a cloth to clean the dried blood at his temple. She felt the tremor in her hands, not from fear of violence, but from the weight of responsibility. All week, she'd wondered if she did the right thing in bringing him here. The townsfolk might brand her a fool or worse, an accomplice, when the Pawnee came looking. But Lenora loved this arid land and its hidden springs. She would defend it, and its people, as fiercely as any rider. A soft groan drew her attention. The warrior's eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes that burned like coals beneath heavy lids. Pain sharpened his gaze, but recognition softened it when he found Lenora's face above him. "You brought me here," he rasped, voice hoarse as wind. "Over sandstone." "Why?" Lenora offered him a cup of water. "Because no man, no matter the cause, should die alone in the desert." He swallowed, doubt and gratitude warring in his gaze. "You risk much." She met his stare, unwavering. "I owe you what any decent soul owes another, mercy." Outside, the wind rose, rattling the shutters and stirring the tumbleweeds into a muted dance. Lenora felt it as a summons, as if the land itself spoke of the gathering storm. Her thoughts drifted to the promise she'd made upon tending his wounds, to stand sure when the Pawnee came to collect their own. Hours passed in quiet vigil. Lenora worked swiftly, binding his wounds, steeping herbs in boiling water, whispering prayers in a tongue half forgotten by her settler's family. The sun climbed, and with it the temperature in the adobe-walled home. Sweat mottled her brow, but she pressed on, driven by an urgency she could scarcely name. At last, the warrior sat up, the cot creaking beneath him. Each movement was agony made flesh, yet his jaw set with determination. "Thank you, Lenora Sinclair," he said, using her name as if invoking a spell of obligation. "I am Tekala, of the Pawnee. My life is bound to yours now." She nodded, brushing a stray lock of silver hair from her face. "Rest now, I will watch over you." He closed his eyes again, exhaustion claiming him. Lenora arranged the blankets around him and stepped outside to draw breath. The sun rested high in the sky now, and Lenora squinted at the distant ridge where she knew Takala's people would appear. Her heart thundered at the thought of 1,000 painted faces, spears gleaming. Demands unspoken, but fierce as the plains wind. She drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Tomorrow, at dawn, Takala's tribe would ride across the desert to claim their debt. She wondered if she had done right by inviting them to her doorstep. But as the sky brightened into afternoon, Lenora felt a fierce pride. She would stand by what she had done, no matter the cost. And so she waited, each moment stretching into eternity. The hush before the storm growing heavy with possibility. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. The sun sank slow and fierce behind the mesas, casting Bitter Ridge into a copper dusk that made even the simplest silhouettes look like shadows from another time. Lenora Sinclair stood at her threshold, hand braced on the rough wood of her doorframe, eyes tracing the horizon for the movement she'd both dreaded and prayed for. Every whisper of wind through the sage brought a memory, her father's lessons in reading sign, her mother's warning that the world rarely repaid kindness in kind. Behind her, Takala stirred on the cot, his deep breathing broken by the occasional grunt of pain. She turned and found his eyes open, their dark depths already searching hers for truths they had no words to share. "You should rest," she said gently. "I have rested enough," he rasped, trying to push himself upright. The makeshift bandages about his chest and arms strained as he moved, and a tremor coursed through him like wind rattling a half-broken fence. Lenora crossed the room in 3 steps, her palms warm and insistent on his shoulder. "Lie back, Takala. Your tribe will come soon. You must be strong enough to meet them." He let out a breath between gritted teeth. "They will come, but it is not only to see me alive. They will come for you too." She shook her head silver, strands escaping her braid. "I have no quarrel with your people. That does not matter," he said, his eyes softened. "A woman alone, sheltering a Pawnee warrior who wears the marks of many enemies, the debt is not just mine to pay." Knock on her door startled them both. It was soft, hesitant. Lenora frowned. No Pawnee warrior would knock like that. She opened the door just wide enough to see the young face of Jeb Martin, the storekeeper's youngest boy. Dust streaked his sunburned cheeks, and fear flickered in his eyes. "Miss Sinclair?" he squeaked. "Pa says you best be careful tonight. Says strangers been spotted on the far ridge. Indian riders maybe. Pa says." He trailed off, eyes darting past her to the figure half-shadowed inside. Jeb's mouth fell open. "Is it true, miss? You really got one of them in there?" Lenora stepped outside and closed the door behind her. The boy's curiosity made her stomach twist. Word would spread fast now. "Tell your father to lock his doors. Light no lamps. Keep your family close." Jeb hesitated, then pulled a scrap of paper from his pocket, pressing it into her palm. "Pa says if you need shelter, come by. He don't want you alone out here." Lenora forced a smile she did not feel. "Thank your father for me, but this is my home. I will not abandon it." The boy scuffed his boot, then backed away. The dust his footsteps kicked up drifted across her porch like ghosts. She watched him disappear into the dusk, the chill of coming night seeping into her bones. When she stepped back inside, Takala sat up fully now, sweat dampening his brow, eyes alight with a simmering heat that no fever could forge. "He saw me." She shrugged out of her shawl and draped it over a chair. "He is just a boy. He will not betray us. He does not need to. The desert carries word faster than any rider." She busied herself at the hearth, adding kindling to the coals that glowed like dying stars. then let it come. I have nothing to hide." Takala watched her for a long time, the crackle of the fire filling the silence between them. "You do not know what it means to bind yourself to me." She turned, her face lit by firelight, every line and crease of her life drawn in stark relief. "I know what it means to stand by what I believe in." Outside, a distant howl cut through the night. Coyote, maybe wolf. Lenora felt it in her spine, the old world pushing at the thin walls of her cabin, reminding her that some debts were too large for any one woman to pay alone. Takala reached out, and she took his hand. His skin was rough with calluses yet. His grip trembled like that of a man who'd carried burdens too long alone. "You have the spirit of the plains in you," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "When my people come, they will see it, they will honor it." She opened her mouth to ask what that meant, but the answer came before she could speak, a soft rhythmic drumming at the edge of hearing. Horses, many of them. She let go of his hand and moved to the window, pushing aside the thin curtain. Down in the valley, a line of dark shapes moved in ghostly procession, the glow of their torches flickering like stars fallen to earth. She counted a dozen riders, maybe more, each astride a Mustang, lean and wild-eyed as the men who rode them. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned back to Takala, but found him already pushing himself off the cot, bracing one hand on the wall to steady himself. "You cannot meet them standing," she protested. "I must." His tone brooked no argument. A warrior must stand or die. She grabbed his arm to steady him, her fingers digging into muscle and bone. "Then lean on me." Together, they crossed the room, each step an agony she felt in her own bones. When they reached the door, she hesitated. Through the thin wood, the distant voices rose, a chorus of men speaking a language older than this land's new name. "Will they take you from me?" she asked, her own voice foreign in her ears. Takala looked down at her, pain and gratitude warring in the lines of his face. "They will repay what you have done, one way or another." The door rattled under the knock, firmer this time. She pressed her forehead to the wood, her heart a hammer in her chest. She thought of her father's old Winchester hanging above the hearth, but she did not move for it. Her hand fell instead to the latch. When she opened the door, the riders filled her yard, painted horses shifting beneath men wrapped in the furs of coyote and buffalo. At their head, an elder whose hair fell to his waist raised a hand in greeting. His eyes, black and bright as obsidian, fell to Takala first, then to Lenora. "You are the woman who saved my son," he said in measured English. Lenora stood straighter, her hand still on Takala's arm. "I did what was right," the elder nodded, his gaze sweeping her homestead. "A debt is owed. We will pay it in the way of our people." He gestured, and behind him, riders peeled away into the culti, into the darkness. Lenora strained to follow their path, but the night swallowed them whole. Only the steady drumming of hooves told her they had not vanished like ghosts. The elder's eyes settled on her again. "By dawn you will understand." Takala's grip on her shoulder tightened. She felt the tremor in him and knew it was not fear but something deeper, a resignation, a promise made flesh. The elder stepped closer. "You have given my son back to me. We will give you back what you have lost." "I have lost nothing," she said, though even she heard the lie in her voice. The elder's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Then you will have more than you know what to do with." He turned and motioned his riders away. One by one, they melted into the night, leaving only the hush of the desert wind and the faint scent of horses lingering on the air. Lenora watched them go, her pulse thundering. She looked at Takala, but his eyes were closed, his body sagging against hers. She guided him back inside, lowered him onto the cot, and covered him again with the old quilt that had once belonged to her mother. She sank into the chair beside him, her breath coming slow and ragged. In the hush that followed, Lenora Sinclair realized that the debt she had welcomed into her home had grown into something far greater than she could ever Repay or escape. Outside. The desert exhaled, the wind carrying whispers of a promise sealed by blood and dawn. She closed her eyes, listening for the hoofbeats that would bring her tomorrow. If you're caught up in this story, don't forget to drop a below and subscribe. Tomorrow brings the next turning of the wheel. Dawn arrived on a whisper of cold air and the faint scent of wild sage, brushing the desert floor with the first pale gold of morning. Lenora Sinclair woke to the rustle of horse hooves in her dreams. No, not in her dreams, she realized as she blinked into wakefulness, but just beyond her shuttered window. Her body felt heavy with a night's worth of worry, her bones stiff from sleeping in the hard-back chair beside Takala's cot. He was gone. For a moment, panic clawed at her chest like a wild thing. She shot to her feet, eyes darting around the small cabin. The blankets lay in a neat fold at the foot of the cot. The water basin had been emptied and refilled. The embers in the hearth glowed warm, tended by a hand not her own. A single black feather rested on the table, delicate, gleaming, the same hue as Takala's hair. She stepped to the door, the cold floorboards biting her bare feet. Her breath fogged the air as she pushed the door open. They were everywhere, horses, wild and free, hundreds of them Mustangs in every shade of dusk and dawn, paint coats flashing white against red flanks, manes tangled and tossing in the wind. Their hooves drummed the earth, the sound like a living heartbeat that rose through her boots and rattled the slats of her porch. Takala stood at the edge of the herd, his posture straight despite his wounds, a spear resting against his shoulder. He looked impossibly strong, as if the land itself had lent him its spine. By his side, the Pawnee elder from the night before waited, face stern beneath the rising sun. The elder raised a hand in greeting. "You are awake, white woman who stands with no tribe," he called, voice carrying across the sea of horses. "Come." Lenora crossed the yard, her boots sinking into fresh hoof prints stamped deep into the sandy soil. As she neared, the Mustangs shifted, creating a path that felt as deliberate as it was impossible. They moved around her like a river parting for a stone. "Why so many?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper as she reached them. The elder gestured to the horizon, where the sun burned away the last of the shadows. 100 horses for one life," he said. "This is our law." "I never asked for this," she protested, glancing at Takala. "I did what anyone would have done." Takala's eyes met hers, a flicker of warmth cutting through the morning chill. "Not anyone. Many would have left me for the crows." The elder stepped closer, close enough that she could see the paint etched into the lines of his weathered face. "You took in our son," he said. "You sheltered him when you could have turned him away. The land remembers debts. So do the people who belong to it." Lenora looked past them, to where the herd stretched as far as she could see, manes flowing like water, eyes bright and curious. "I don't need horses," she said. "I need peace." The elder's lips twitched into something like a smile. "One does not ride the plains alone and remain untouched. Now you are part of our story. And we are part of yours." Takala stepped forward, placing a hand over hers where it clenched the hem of her shawl. "You gave me your strength," he said. "These Mustangs are our promise to you, that you will never stand alone again." A wind rose, tousling her hair and setting the horses to shifting. The elder raised his hands, and the warriors who rode with him began to sing low and rhythmic, a chant that made the Mustangs toss their heads and snort steam into the dawn. Takala leaned closer, his voice so low she almost didn't catch the words. "When you look to the horizon and see our riders, you will remember you have kin in the wind." The herd shifted again, splitting apart to reveal a young roan mare, her coat shining like polished copper. A rope lay loosely around her neck. Lenora felt the earth move beneath her feet as the mare stepped forward, her eyes meeting Lenora's as if in challenge. "This one is yours," Takala said. Lenora reached out, her hand trembling as it brushed the mare's muzzle. The horse did not flinch, did not shy. It simply breathed out a soft, hot huff that smelled of grass and open plains. "What am I supposed to do with 100 horses?" she asked, her voice cracking under the weight of it all. The elders' laughter rolled across the yard, warm and surprising. "You listen to them, you ride them. You set them free when they wish it. They will feed you when times are lean, carry you when your feet grow tired, and remind you that nothing given in trust is ever truly owned." Takala stepped back, wincing as he shifted his wounded side. "Your debt is paid, Lenora Sinclair. But ours to you will last as long as the wind carries our stories." For a heartbeat, the world held its breath, the sun cresting the ridge, the Mustangs rippling like a living sea, the desert hushed in awe of its own wildness. Then the elder raised his staff and the herd turned as one, thunder rolling across the valley as they melted into the scrub and sage. Only the young roan remained, standing at Lenora's side as if she'd always belonged there. She turned to thank Takala, but he was already mounting his own horse, the elder beside him. They looked back only once. "If trouble rides in," Takala called, "send word to the Pawnee. We will come." Lenora raised a hand in farewell. "And if you ever need shelter, you have given enough," the elder said. "Now you live, ride, breathe the wind as we do." The riders wheeled and vanished into the desert, leaving only hoofprints and the echo of their promise. Lenora stood alone in the yard, the roan mare nudging her shoulder like a child begging for her attention. She laughed a bright, raw sound that startled the crows from the cottonwoods. "Come on then," she murmured, running a hand down the mare's sleek neck. "Let's see if I remember how to ride." She turned toward the rising sun, her shadow stretching long and strong behind her. No longer alone, but bound now to a story far bigger than any one woman could claim. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. Lenora Sinclair awoke to the rustle of dry grass and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above Bitter Ridge. The young roan mare stood tethered by the well, flicking her tail at the early morning flies. The rest of the Mustangs had vanished. At dawn, like smoke on the wind, leaving behind only hoofprints and the promise of a bond that felt heavier with each passing hour. Inside the homestead, Lenora's world seemed changed yet unchanged all at once. The rough timber beams overhead still creaked with the familiar lament of wind and age. The hearth still bore the black smudge of countless fires, but every sound now echoed louder, as if the walls strained to contain the weight of what had passed. She moved to the window and pushed it open. The desert air rushed in, sharp and clean. In the distance, a dust trail rose from the road, a single rider making their slow approach. Lenora's heart skipped in her chest. Her hand hovered over the latch of her father's Winchester mounted above the door, but she hesitated. Takala's words drifted back to her. "You will never stand alone again." She stepped out onto the porch, squinting into the morning sun as the rider drew near. A young boy, Jeb Martin, rode a mule so thin its ribs showed like the beams of her roof. He dismounted awkwardly, one boot scraping the hard-packed earth. "Miss Sinclair," he called, hat clutched in his hands. "Pa says you best come quick. There's talk in town, angry talk." She felt the cold settle into her bones despite the rising heat. "What sort of talk, Jeb?" "They're saying you sheltered a savage, that you're bringing danger down on Bitter Ridge, some of them. Want to ride out here, make sure you ain't hiding more of them." Lenora's hand clenched around the porch rail. She could almost see them, the storekeepers, the ranchers, men who had once traded fair with her father, now sharpening words into weapons. She forced her voice steady. "Thank you, Jeb. Tell your father I appreciate the warning." The boy shifted from foot to foot, kicking up a swirl of dust. "Pa says you should come into town, let folks see you're no traitor. Says if you stay out here alone." He trailed off, eyes wide with something like fear or awe. "Well, folks get ideas," Lenora glanced at the roan mare. The young horse watched her, ears twitching as if it could read her unease. She had not yet found the courage to saddle it, to ride it beyond her own fence line. But the thought of facing Bitter Ridge on foot made her stomach twist. "I'll come," she said finally. "Go on ahead, Jeb. Tell your father I'll be right behind you." When the boy rode off, she lingered in the doorway for a long moment. The homestead seemed suddenly small, a cabin not large enough to hold the burden of 100 Mustangs, or the judgment of an entire town. She laid her palm on the doorframe, as if to draw strength from the wood that had sheltered her family through drought and dust storms. The ride into Bitter Ridge was longer than she remembered. The roan mare moved like a ghost beneath her, hooves silent in the soft sand. She felt the eyes on her before she saw the people, women clutching baskets at the well, men gathered outside the general store, all watching the lone figure on the painted horse. Old Bill Renner, the blacksmith, stepped forward as she tied the mare to a post. His face, once warm and broad as the sun, was drawn tight now, eyes narrowed beneath his sweat-darkened hat. "Miss Sinclair," he said, voice-like, a hammer striking an anvil. "We heard tell you took in one of them Pawnee. Is it true?" Lenora squared her shoulders. "It is." A murmur rippled through the small crowd. Someone spat in the dust. Bill jerked his chin toward her. "And these horses?" 100 Mustangs running through folks' pasture land, breaking fences, spooking cattle. "That's you doing too?" "They are a gift," Lenora said, her voice stronger than she felt. "A promise that if any of us ever need, a promise." This came from Martha Holloway, the storekeeper's wife, her cheeks red with anger. "We don't need savage promises, Lenora. We need fences that stand and stock, that don't bolt at shadows." A man she didn't know stepped from the shadows of the saloon's porch, his hat pulled low. His boots were polished but dusty, the revolver on his hip clean and oiled. "Miss Sinclair," he drawled, his accent not local, each word dipped. "In honey and poison both, these people are right to wonder if you've chosen sides." She met his gaze. There was something off about him, a coldness behind the courteous smile. "And who might you be?" "Name's Hawkins, Wade Hawkins." He tipped his hat. "I'm here on behalf of the Territorial Authority. They don't much like the idea of alliances that cross certain lines." "You're no lawman," she shot back. "I know every deputy this side of the Painted Valley." Hawkins' smile never reached his eyes. "Sometimes law rides in other coats. Truth is, Miss Sinclair, folks are scared. And feared is funny things to a town." A hush fell over the street. Lenora felt the eyes on her. Neighbors who had once traded eggs and flour with her mother, now standing as if she'd grown horns overnight. She thought of Takala's promise, of the herd that thundered like a heartbeat through the canyons. She thought of the roan mare, patient and watching. "I stand with Bitter Ridge," she said, her voice rising. "Same as I always have. But if fear is what you choose, then make no mistake, you ride that path alone. The Pawnee do not break. Their word, if you send trouble my way, they will come. And they will not come empty-handed." Bill Renner looked at her, his jaw working. For a heartbeat, she saw the man who'd once given her a carved wooden horse for Christmas when she was 5. Then that memory flickered out. "You've brought the old world back to our door," he said quietly. "I pray you know what you're doing, Lenora." She untied the mare and mounted, boots slipping into the stirrups like she'd been born to it. She met Hawkins' stare with her own. "Tell the authority they can find me where they always have, on my land, under my sky." As she turned the mare toward the open road, the wind picked up. She felt it brush her cheeks, heard it carry a whisper through the scrub and sage. "You do not stand alone." She rode back toward the Painted Valley, her shadow long against the rising sun, the dust of Bitter Ridge settling behind her like an old memory refusing to die. If this tale keeps your spirit riding, drop a and make sure you're subscribed. There's more dust and thunder ahead. Lenora Sinclair rode back toward her homestead as the wind tugged at her hair and the roan's hooves drummed the steady promise into the packed earth. The road felt longer than it had that morning, the sky bigger and heavier, like it had learned. All her secrets overnight. Behind her, Bitter Ridge shrank into a smudge of wood and stone, the town's whispers carried on the breeze. She could almost hear the worry in Jeb Martin's voice, the cold weight behind Wade Hawkins' smile. She replayed Bill Renner's words like a hymn turned sour. I pray you know what you're doing. The roan Mare seemed to sense her thoughts. The horse's ears flicked back and forth, head tossing now and again as if to remind her that a promise was more than words. It was muscle and bone, wind and hoofbeats, a bond made real in every breath that, by the time Lenora crested the low rise that overlooked her homestead, the sun hung low, the painted cliffs behind her cabin catching fire in the dying light. But what drew her up short, what made the air freeze in her throat, was the thin plume of black smoke rising from behind the barn. She spurred the Mare forward, boots slamming against its flanks. They hit the yard at a run. Flames licked up the dry boards of the hay shed, catching and crackling with greedy hunger. She leapt from the saddle, grabbing the old bucket she kept by the well, but even as she pumped water, her mind raced ahead. Who did this? Who watched me ride into town and waited? As she flung water onto the edges of the blaze, she heard a hiss more air than voice, and turned to see shadows slipping away into the dusk. Men in broad hats, their boots ghosting over the sand. One turned back just once, and she thought. She glimpsed a grin in the firelight, cold and mocking. Cowards, she shouted, her voice cracking. She flung the bucket after them, but it clattered uselessly against the fence. The flames took the rest. She worked until her arms gave out, until her throat was raw from smoke and cinders. When the fire finally died, the hay shed was a blackened skeleton, its charred ribs jutting at the stars. She sank onto the porch, the roan Mare standing watch beside her, its nostrils wide, breath steaming in the cool night. A single ember drifted free, landing on her boot. She crushed it under her heel, in the hush that followed. The wind spoke again, rustling the cottonwoods, brushing ash from the scorched earth. Somewhere in that hush, she heard a different sound, hoofbeats, Lenora's. Heart lurched. She pushed herself upright, eyes narrowing into the dark. The shape that emerged from the shadows was not Pawnee. Not a rider at all, but a figure on foot, limping heavily. Doc Green? She called, disbelieving. The old man stepped into the pale moonlight, breathless and bent. His spectacles were askew, and the satchel he carried swung awkwardly from his shoulder. Lenora, he wheezed, they're coming back. She helped him onto the porch. Who? The same men who did this. Hawkins' boys. He pulled a flask from his coat, took a burning swig, then wiped his mouth. They mean to finish what they started. Drive you out or worse. She sank onto the steps beside him. And Bitter Ridge? He snorted. Some want no part of it. Others turned a blind eye. Bill Renner tried to stand up, but they're scared. Lenora, fear makes cowards of the best of us. The roan nickered, stamping a hoof. Lenora glanced at the darkness beyond the yard. Did you see how many? 5, maybe 6. Not counting Hawkins, armed, mean. They're waiting for full dark. Lenora's mind spun. She thought of Takala's promise. She thought of the 100 Mustangs hidden somewhere in the canyons, hooves ready to answer an unspoken call. Doc, she said quietly, can you ride? He barked a laugh that turned into a cough. No, but I can shoot. And patch up whoever's left when it's done. She rose and stepped into the house. Her father's Winchester felt heavier than she remembered. She checked the cartridges full, clean, ready. She laid it across her lap as she sank into the chair by the window. Doc Green settled into the rocker beside her, wheezing but determined. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the shutters. It carried more than dust tonight. It carried the weight of choices, old and new. A distant coyote howled, its cry swallowed by the hush that follows before men do evil. Lenora's fingers tightened on the stock of the rifle. She felt the wood press against her palm, real and grounding. The roan mare shifted near the porch, head high, ears twitching. Somewhere in the dark, bootsteps scraped across gravel. Doc Green's voice was a whisper. It begins. She exhaled, slow and steady. I do not stand alone. She remembered Takala's eyes, the elder's promise, the herd thundering like a storm at dawn. She imagined the desert listening, waiting. A match flared outside, too close, too bold. A voice called, mocking, "Come on out, Miss Sinclair. No need to hide. You made your bed with savages, come lie in it." Lenora's pulse slowed. She thought of her mother's hands on hers, showing her how to sight down the barrel. She pictured the ridge behind her homestead where, if she called, they might come wind, hoofbeats. A det returned a HUNDREDF. Oli. Another match, another spark. A figure stepped too close to the porch. Lenora squeezed the trigger. The night split open with the crack of the Winchester. When the echo died, a single man lay in the dust, groaning, his revolver lost to the dark. Doc Green's voice trembled. "You know what this means, Lenora?" She rose, chambering another round. "Yes, it means the debt is coming due, for all of us." Outside, the wind carried a new sound, low, distant, like thunder rolling over stone. The mare turned her head, ears forward, eyes wide. Lenora smiled, a bitter, fierce thing. "You do not stand alone." She stepped out onto the porch. Rifle raised, Doc Green behind her. The roan snorting like a sentry at her shoulder. And from the painted valley, the night began to tremble with the promise of hoofbeats. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. Lenora Sinclair stood at the edge of her porch, the stock of her father's Winchester snug against her shoulder, her breath coming in measured pulls that matched the pulse she felt in her temples. The desert night pressed close, thick with the tang of burnt hay and the acrid ghosts of the shed fire now reduced to blackened bones behind the barn. But under all that, a deeper note thrummed through the ground, a low, distant rumble that could not have been wind alone. Doc Green crouched by the door, his old revolver resting on his knee, eyes flicking between the shadows that crept just beyond the reach of the single lantern burning by the porch rail. The roan mare stood hobbled near the well, head high, ears pivoting like weather vanes toward the horizon. Now and then she'd stamp and toss her mane, nostrils flaring at scents the human nose could not name. "They'll try again," Doc rasped, his words shivering in the chill air. "Men like Hawkins never stop when they think they can still win." Lenora didn't answer. Her eyes were on the ridge beyond her fence line. There, under the waning moon, shadows moved slow, patient, the shape of men trying to be ghosts. But the desert didn't care for ghosts. It remembered everything. She could almost hear Takala's voice. "When you look to the horizon and see our riders, you will remember you have kin in the wind." One of the shadows stepped into the moonlight. Hawkins. He wore his polished boots and a wide grin that leaned like a blade. He lifted his arms, mock surrender, though the rifle slung over his shoulder betrayed the lie. "Miss Sinclair," he called, voice smooth and loud enough to carry to every boarded window of Bitter Ridge. "Let's not drag this out, eh? We just want the horses. You don't need them. A single woman can't handle 100 Mustangs. You give them up, and we walk away." Lenora sighted down the barrel. "Try it. You won't walk far." Hawkins laughed a sound that didn't touch his eyes. "You're one stubborn spinster, I'll give you that. But do you really think they'll come for you? Your red friends?" Lenora didn't answer. She didn't have to. The thunder in the earth grew clearer now, separating from the wind, a drumming cadence that set the roan mare pacing circles around the well. Doc Green heard it too. His eyes darted to her, wide behind his crooked spectacles. "Is that what I think it is?" Lenora's lips twitched. Better hope so, Doc. Hawkins' men fanned out 6 of them, rifles glinting under the moon, boots crunching in dry brush. She could see them now, the nervous glances, the sweat at their temples. They didn't understand yet, not fully. But they would. Hawkins pointed at her, grin gone sharp. This is your last chance. You give me the horses, the land, and I might let you stay. Hell, I might even find you a husband in town who'd take pity on you. Lenora lowered the rifle, only to cock it with a single smooth motion. You want my horses? She called. Come claim them. A beat. The night sucked in its breath. Then a shape moved behind Hawkins, low and fast, an impossible blur that coalesced into a mounted figure, a Pawnee warrior. Then another and another. Behind them, the desert came alive with the gleam of manis and the white flash of painted spears. Hawkins turned, his curse smothered by the roar of hoofbeats pouring over the ridge like a dam breaking. He swung his rifle around, but his men stumbled. Back, eyes wide, boots slipping in the sand. Lenora stepped off the porch and leveled her Winchester. Doc, if you're gonna shoot, shoot now. The doctor barked a laugh that ended in a cough, then rose beside her, revolver raised. Wouldn't miss this for the world. The first Pawnee riders swept into the yard, hooves striking sparks off stone, war cries ripping the hush to shreds. Hawkins fired wildly, his shot going wide, harmlessly into the barn wall. Lenora squeezed her trigger once Hawkins' rifle flew from his hands as the round clipped the barrel. Twisting it from his grip, Pawnee warriors dismounted in a fluid motion, grabbing 2 of Hawkins' men, hauling them from their feet as easily as plucking weeds. The rest fled, one dropping his weapon in the dust as he ran. Hawkins fell to his knees in front of Lenora, eyes wide. You can't do this. The law Kakala emerged from the swirling mass of horses, his chest still bandaged but his spear steady in his grip. He spoke low, in his own tongue, the words rolling like distant thunder. The elder who had led the Mustangs now sat his horse at the edge of the yard, face unreadable in the moonlight. Kakala pointed his spear at Hawkins. You lit the fire, he said in English. You break her roof, you break your own shelter. Hawkins spat blood onto the dirt. She's nothing, one woman. This land should be ours. Lenora stepped closer, her boots stirring ash from the fire's remains. I am one woman. And yet you came with 6 men and still failed. I'd say that makes you nothing. Kakala flicked his spear. 2 warriors dragged Hawkins to his feet. Lenora's eyes met the elder's, and a silent understanding passed between them. Mercy had its cost, but so did leaving debts unpaid. Take him to the Painted Valley, she said. Let him see how the land remembers every footprint. The elder nodded. Hawkins' protests vanished into the rising chorus of hoofbeats as the warriors led him away. The other men who had fled were already dots in the darkness, unlikely to look back. Doc Green leaned on his revolver, wheezing out a laugh that cracked like dry kindling. Well, Miss Sinclair, you didn't stand alone, did you? Lenora lowered the Winchester. The roan mare pressed her muzzle against her arm, warm and alive, the same promise made flesh. She looked to Kakala, who stood silent at the yard's edge. Thank you. He inclined his head, eyes glinting with something between a smile and a warning. The wind remembers. So does the tribe. Lenora touched the mare's mane, feeling the heat of its heartbeat under her palm. Bitter Ridge might not understand what had happened here tonight, might never see beyond the old fears and the new stories, but she did. She had kin in the wind now. And when the dust settled, Bitter Ridge would have to choose whether to fear that truth or live with it. As the Pawnee riders vanished into the Painted Valley, the night fell quiet again, broken only by the sigh of wind through the burned shed and the gentle nicker of the young roan, standing guard in the moonlight. Lenora Sinclair lifted her gaze to the horizon and whispered, I do not stand alone. If this storm has you hooked, drop a and subscribe. Tomorrow the wind carries. The next turn of the story. At dawn, the world around Bitter Ridge felt raw and new, as if the wind itself had decided to wash the desert clean with the hush of promise and threat mingled together. Lenora Sinclair stood at her well, a tin cup in her hand, the pump handle squealing like an old fiddle. The water came up cold, smelling faintly of iron and deep stone. She drank slow, eyes on the far horizon where the painted valley slept under a blanket of rising sun. The roan mare grazed nearby, occasionally lifting her head to sniff the air, ears swiveling at every soft stir of morning. The burned shell of the hay shed still smoked faintly, a warning carved in black timber. Lenora had spent half the night stamping out the embers and the other half standing guard with Doc Green at her side. Now Doc lay snoring in her old rocking chair on the porch, a threadbare blanket across his knees, revolver still within reach. She thought about Hawkins and the way the Pawnee riders had taken him away. Some men would say she'd handed him over to savages, but Lenora understood what real justice looked like. Hawkins had always assumed the land owed him something. But out here, debts were paid in flesh, not promises. She set the cup on the wellstone and turned at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. At first she thought it was just the wind playing tricks. But the roan lifted her head sharply, nostrils flaring. Over the rise came a small group of riders, 4, maybe 5, not Pawnee. White men, rough around the edges with the look of drifters, who'd been rode hard by the trail and by life. One wore a deputy's badge, tarnished and half buried under his duster. The man in front carried himself like a man used to getting what he asked for. His mustache drooped like the corners of his eyes. Lenora stepped off the porch, Doc stirring awake behind her. She didn't bother to reach for the Winchester propped by the door yet. Not yet. The lead rider tipped his hat. Miss Sinclair? Marshal Pritchard. Out of Fort Kestrel. You know why we're here? She didn't blink. I can guess. Hawkins ran to the law before he ran out of luck, did he? Pritchard's eyes darted to the charred ruin of the shed, to the roan mare standing guard like an old spirit reborn. Some in Bitter Ridge claim you've been aiding hostiles, that you're planning to turn this valley over to the Pawnee, that you've got a herd of wild horses you mean to sell to fund a war. She barked a laugh, low and sharp. A war? This land's had nothing but wars since the first wagons came over the ridge. And I don't sell promises. Doc Green shuffled up beside her, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Marshal, you'll forgive my saying so, but if you came looking to lay blame, you're barking up the wrong cactus. This woman saved a man's life. She didn't light the fire that took her. Barn. One of Pritchard's men spit in the dirt, gaze sliding across Lenora like she was something to be appraised and bartered. And yet there's talk. Horses running wild, fences trampled. Good folk nervous. Hawkins, Lenora cut him off, voice cold as well water. Hawkins brought the fire to my door. He got his answer. The marshal's eyes settled on her again, searching for cracks. He found none. The territorial authority don't care for rumors, Miss Sinclair. They care about calm. They care about taxes paid and land kept safe for settlers. If you can't keep the peace here, they'll send soldiers to do it for you. Her jaw tightened. They'll send soldiers to drive out every last Pawnee family that still calls this valley home. You want that on your hands? Silence fell. Pritchard shifted in his saddle. The men behind him glanced at each other, uneasy. The desert wind picked up, rattling the brittle bones of the burned shed like dry laughter. Doc cleared his throat. Marshal, if I may, this valley remembers what we forget. Folks forget that before fences and rails, this land ran under different names. Miss Sinclair has reminded us that debt and kindness walk the same trail. Pritchard sighed. I'm not here to spill blood. You got any idea where Hawkins is now? Lenora felt a slow, grim smile spread across her face. He's paying his debt. The Pawnee see to that. Pritchard shifted again, but the fight had left his eyes. Then maybe we'll let this ride. For now, but you keep your horses off people's land, Miss Sinclair. You keep your peace. And if trouble comes, I'll meet it at the fence." "Line," she said. Like always. The marshal tipped his hat once more. His men wheeled their horses, boots stirring dust that floated like old ghosts over the dry earth. They rode off without another word, back toward Bitter Ridge, where rumors grew like weeds in thirsty soil. When they were gone, Doc let out a sigh that rattled the porch boards. "You're not finished with them, you know." Lenora leaned against the railing, the roan mare pressing its muzzle to her shoulder. "I know." Doc studied her face for a long time. "You afraid?" She shook her head. "Not of them." She glanced at the painted valley shimmering in the heat, the place where hoofbeats still echoed at dawn. "I'm afraid of forgetting. Of forgetting who we owe, and what we promised." The roan huffed, its breath warm on her neck. Somewhere beyond the hills, she swore she heard the distant roll of drums, not thunder this time, but the steady heartbeat of a people who watched from just beyond the visible world. Doc followed her gaze. "They'll come again, won't they, when the wind changes?" Lenora smiled, fierce and gentle all at once. "So will I." Behind them, the land held its breath, waiting for the next storm. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you." The dusk that fell over Bitter Ridge was the sort that made even the bravest cattle dog slink close to the fire, tail curled tight against the promise of a long, cold night. Lenora Sinclair stood just beyond the reach of her cabin's lamplight, one hand resting on the roan mare's warm flank, the other brushing the Winchester that leaned ready against the porch rail. Above her, the stars blinked through a veil of low drifting clouds dim, lanterns for a land that liked its secrets buried deep. 3 days had passed since Marshal Pritchard and his men rode back to Fort Kestrel, promising calm that tasted like cheap whiskey, thin and easy to forget. Doc Green had returned to town that morning, refusing to stay hidden behind her walls any longer. "You've got your Pawnee riders," he'd said, his old eyes sharp as a hawk's. "But Bitter Ridge is my post too. They'll need someone to remind them you're not the witch they want you to be." So now she stood alone, or as alone as a woman can be when the earth under her boots still thrummed with hoofbeats from a promise paid in blood and wild horses. Somewhere out beyond her fence line, the painted valley whispered to the dark. She imagined the Pawnee scouts watching, hidden in the folds of sage and shadow, keeping their own word as surely as the wind kept its. She felt them before she heard them, a hush in the brush, the faint creak of saddle leather, the quiet click of a bridle against a horse's teeth. When the first shape emerged from the gloom, her hand tightened on the Winchester. But she did not raise it. "Easy," she called, voice even as the desert night. "Come in the open." The figure stepped forward, small, thin, a boy maybe 16, with hair the color of raven's wings and eyes that looked older than the distant cliffs. He wore a battered coat, the sleeves too long, the shoulders too narrow. Behind him, 3 more slipped into view, 2 men and a woman, each with the same wary posture, the same half-starved look that said they'd been chased more than they'd ever been fed. "Who are you?" Lenora asked, though she already knew the answer. The boy's boots were more whole than leather, but the feathers braided at his wrist told her what the moonlight could not. Pawnee, or what was left when the cavalry burned out the winter lodges and called it progress. The boy touched his forehead with 2 fingers, a gesture half prayer, half challenge. "They said you would help," Takala said. At the name, something settled low in Lenora's chest, a warmth heavy as a stone. She stepped back, pushing open the cabin door. "Come in then. No one sleeps outside tonight." The boy hesitated, one hand hovering over the iron latch nailed to the doorframe. Lenora could almost hear the argument raging behind his eyes. Pride, caution, the hard lessons beaten into him by men who thought kindness a weakness. But the wind was cold, and the girl behind him shivered under a blanket so thin it was more holes than wool. When they crossed her threshold, they brought the smell of campfire smoke and the raw edge of the prairie with them. Lenora stoked the hearth while they settled near the warm stones, boots turned out, eyes fixed anywhere but hers. She ladled stew from the pot that hung over the coals, more broth than meat, but it filled the hollows in their cheeks. When she handed the boy his bowl, his fingers brushed hers calloused and cracked. A child's hands turned to a man's too soon. "You have names?" she asked. The boy looked up, dark eyes steady. "Elin." He jerked his chin at the girl dozing by the fire. "My sister Bluebird. The other two, Bear and Crow. Do you know why Takala sent you to me?" Elin sipped his stew, the steam ghosting around his face. "Because you gave shelter. Once. You did not ask if he was worth it. He says you stand when others bow." Lenora leaned back against the table, her fingers tapping a restless beat. "This is Bitter Ridge, Elin. The folks here are scared enough of me as it is. You stay, they'll think we're planning a war." Bear spoke up then, his voice like gravel dragged over dry stone. "Maybe we are." Lenora's eyes snapped to his. He did not look away. In the firelight, she saw the deep scars along his jaw, the ragged edge of an old bullet wound that had never healed right. "We're tired of running," Bear said. "Tired of watching the cavalry take everything. Tired of being told to wait for mercy that never comes." Bluebird stirred, her small hand reaching for Elin's sleeve. He brushed her hair back, whispering soft words in Pawnee that Lenora could not understand, but felt all the same like the wind through broken branches. Lenora crossed to the window, pushing aside the thin curtain. Outside, the night pressed. Close, thick with unseen shapes and the secrets of men who'd never forgive a woman for standing alone. The roan mare dozed by the barn gate, its flank rising and falling like a bellows. "If you stay," she said without turning, "the townsfolk will come for you. They'll come for me. And this time, Hawkins won't be the one leading them. They'll send men in uniform, with letters signed by men who never set foot on this dirt." Elin rose, moving to stand beside her. His shoulder barely reached hers, but his presence filled the room like a mountain. "Then they will find us here, together." Lenora met his eyes, searching for some crack, some sliver of doubt. She found none. The boy's gaze was old stone, carved by wind and time. She exhaled through her teeth, slow and resigned. "Then we best be ready." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's single window pane. The fire popped in the hearth, sending sparks drifting toward the beam where her father's old wedding ring still hung on a nail, a charm for protection. He used to say. Tonight, it felt like a promise made again. Lenora reached for the Winchester. "Tomorrow," she said, voice low but steady, "we'll ride the fence line. If Bitter Ridge means to find us, they'll know exactly where to look." Bear grunted approval. Crow said nothing, only leaned forward to toss another log on the fire. Bluebird slept, her hand still wrapped tight around her brother's sleeve. When the last embers burned down, Lenora stepped out onto the porch one final time. The roan lifted its head, soft eyes watching her as if waiting for her to speak the words she'd buried for too long. "I do not stand alone," she murmured, brushing her hand along the mare's warm neck dot in the painted valley. Far beyond the circle of her lamplight, something answered, a distant rolling echo of hoofbeats. In the dark, if you feel the wind changing with this tale, drop a and make sure you're subscribed. The next chapter rides closer than you think. Dawn came like a promise wrapped in a threat. Thin strands of gray light slipped through the clouds hanging over Bitter Ridge, casting the land in hues of pewter and ash. Lenora Sinclair stood at her fence line, the Winchester resting in the crook of her elbow, her breath rising in pale ghosts that drifted past the roan mare's ears. Behind her, the cabin looked smaller than it ever had, one window cracked, the front porch sagging under the weight of her father's old rocking chair, where Doc Green had spent the last week pretending not to be afraid. Now he was back in town, leaving Lenora with the handful of Pawnee who'd come to her door like shadows asking for light. Elin stood at her shoulder, his eyes scanning the far ridge where the road snaked toward Bitter Ridge. Bluebird hovered near the barn, gathering dry sticks for a cooking fire that had yet to warm the chill from their bones. Bear and Crow worked on the corral, tightening the rails that would hold the Mustangs should they return with more than they could ride. Every few minutes, Lenora heard the low rumble of hoofbeats echo through the painted valley, a reminder. Promise. A threat if needed. You ever been to Bitter Ridge? Lenora asked Elin without turning. The boy shook his head. My father traded there once, many winters ago. He tilted his chin toward the horizon. They will come soon. Men who fear the wind fear what rides in it. She almost smiled at that almost. But the faint smear of smoke rising from the ridge reminded her that men like Hawkins were rarely alone in the end. Someone always came to collect the debts they left behind. What happens when they come for you? She asked him. For all of you, Elin's eyes didn't waver. We stand or we run. But not alone. Lenora's fingers flexed on the rifle's worn stock. She remembered her mother's voice. You were born in a storm, girl. Remember that when the wind howls. She turned, walking the fence line where fresh tracks told the story of last night's restless Mustangs. They hadn't left, not fully. Their prints were a map of loyalty she could almost read. Loops and circles around the yard. Deeper impressions where they'd bedded down under the moon. When she reached the gate, she saw Bear and Crow watching. Bear's eyes were dark hollows under the brim of his battered hat. Crow just nodded once, a signal she'd come to read as agreement and warning all at once. You think they'll try tonight? Lenora asked. Bear spat into the dirt, wiping his mouth with the back of his sleeve. They won't wait long. Men with fire in their bellies don't sleep easy. Crow pointed with his chin toward the painted valley, where the land rose in soft humps and folds like the back of some great sleeping animal. A flicker of movement caught her eye, just a flash of light, the glint of sun off something metal. Then gone. They watched too, Crow said. His voice was soft, a deep rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. They wait. Lenora glanced back at the cabin. Inside, Bluebird's laughter rose for just a moment, thin, uncertain, but sweet as a lark's note in the hush. The sound sliced through her chest like a knife. You all need to go, she said, her voice low but firm. If they see you here when they come. Elin's voice cut her off. No, you took us in. We stay. Bear's jaw set like iron. This is not your fight alone. Lenora looked from one face to the next. These battered souls who had come to her door carrying nothing but scars and the weight of survival. She wanted to tell them she was enough to hold this line herself. She wanted to lie. But the wind rustled the dry sage at her feet, whispering truth instead. They'll bring rifles this time, she said. Maybe a deputy or two from Kestrel. Soldiers if Pritchard gets spooked enough. You ready to bleed for land that's never cared who it buries? Crow stepped forward. Land remembers. He placed his palm flat on the fence post, fingers spread like roots. And so do we. She felt her throat tighten, but she forced it down. There was no room for softness when the storm was already crawling over the ridge. That night, the stars stayed hidden behind a shroud of rolling clouds. Lenora sat on her porch steps, the Winchester across her knees, her eyes fixed on the thin line of lanterns flickering in Bitter Ridge miles away. She could feel the promise of hooves under her boots, the weight of wild horses breathing slow. In the canyons, waiting for her word, Bluebird curled up by the hearth, her soft snore a lullaby for a house that hadn't known children's dreams in too many years. Bear and Crow took turns patrolling the fence line, voices low when they passed close enough for her to hear, Talk of kin buried where no white fence would ever keep them safe. Talk of stories whispered to the wind so the wind would carry them. Forward, Elin sat beside her, the small knife in his hands tracing the grain of an old pine stick. When she looked at him, she didn't see a boy anymore. She saw the last flame of a people who would not die quiet. You could still run, she told him. Elin didn't look up. So could you. She let out a breath that felt too big for her chest. Then I guess we stay. Thunder rolled in the distance, soft, too far off to be real yet, but real enough in her bones. She thought of the herd that had come for her once already, thought of Dakala's voice and the black feather he'd left behind. She wondered if the old ones out there in the Painted Valley slept easy, knowing they'd lent their wind to a woman who had nothing left to trade but her name. When dawn came again, the fence line would stand. And so would she. Two more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications. At first light, the wind tasted of rain, a promise the desert never made lightly. Lenora Sinclair pulled her coat tight as she walked the fence line, the Winchester slung over one shoulder, the roan mare stepping behind her like a loyal ghost. She paused at each post, pressing her gloved palm to the rough wood, listening for the story it held. Every post was a marker, every rail a line in the sand that Bitter Ridge seemed determined to cross. Behind her, the cabin smoked from its single stovepipe. Bluebird gathered wild onions in a small basket, her bare feet leaving prints in the damp earth. Elin and Bear checked the traps they'd set overnight, hoping for a rabbit or two. Crow sharpened a blade on the porch, his eyes never straying. Far from the horizon, Lenora's boots hit the hard pan at the edge of her land just as the sun broke over the Painted Valley. In the distance, she saw the glint of metal rifles, bayonets, badges. A line of riders, maybe a dozen strong, moving. Like a snake through the low scrub, she felt the roan press its nose against her back, and she reached up, scratching behind its ear. "Not yet, girl," she murmured. "Not yet." She turned and found Elin beside her, his eyes sharp under the shadow of his dark hair. He held out a battered canteen, its leather strap patched in 3 places. "Water," he said simply. Lenora took a sip, letting it wash the dust from her throat. "You ever wonder," she said, handing it back, "if this land will ever be worth all this?" Elin's mouth twitched. "Land is just land. The stories make it worth the fight." They stood side by side as the riders crested the rise and came into full view. Marshal Pritchard led them, his broad shoulders hunched under a dark duster, his badge glinting like a star that had fallen and lost its shine. Behind him, a scatter of Bitter Ridge men rode double-barreled and tight-jawed Bill Bellrenner among them, his blacksmith's apron traded for a rifle and a hard squint. One man rode a head taller than the rest. A stranger, coat too clean for the trail, boots polished, the gleam of a cavalry officer's rank half hidden under a travel cloak. Lenora's stomach sank at the sight. "Soldiers," Elin said, voice flat. "Of course," Lenora murmured. "When rumors fail, they send letters. When letters fail, they send lead." The riders pulled up just shy of the gate. Pritchard lifted one hand in greeting. The officer beside him did not bother with the courtesy. "Miss Sinclair." The marshal called, "I'd like a word." Lenora hooked her thumb into her belt. "You brought an army for a word?" Pritchard's mouth twitched, but his eyes were tired. "I didn't want it this way." The officer leaned forward. "By order of the territorial authority, you are to disband any so-called private militia under your roof and relinquish the herd of Mustangs currently roving this valley. Failure to comply will be taken as an act of rebellion." Bear and Crow appeared at Lenora's flanks. Bluebird stood by the cabin, a single arrow notched against a bow that looked too light for her hands. Elin moved closer, his shoulder brushing hers. "This is your answer to a fire you started yourselves?" Lenora asked. Her voice was calm, but her pulse hammered in her throat. The officer ignored her words. His gaze shifted to Elin and the others. These are hostiles. They'll leave with us. Or they'll not leave at all. Pritchard cleared his throat. Easy now. Easy died the day you let Hawkins torch my shed, Lenora snapped. She raised her voice, letting it carry across the fence line. This land owes you nothing. And I owe you nothing. I stand here because this is my line. I will not step back from it. The officer's jaw ticked. He raised one gloved hand. The line of riders shifted, rifles lifted, the dry snap of cocked hammers echoing across the yard. Bear spat into the dirt. Crow lowered his knife to his side, the blade glinting like a shard of moon. Lenora stepped forward, the fence rail the only thing separating her from a storm of lead. The roan mare pressed close, its breath hot against her neck. Marshal, she said, her eyes never leaving the officer. You really want to watch this become a graveyard? Pritchard looked at her, really looked, and something old and worn crumbled in his eyes. Stand down, he barked. Stand down. The officer's hand froze mid-signal. Marshal, you're out of line. Pritchard turned his horse sideways, cutting the line between Lenora and the waiting guns. No, I'm drawing the line. Bitter Ridge can't take another war. Not over a woman willing to stand when the rest of us forgot how. Silence stretched. Like rawhide pulled too tight. The men behind Pritchard shifted, uneasy. Bill Renner spat into the dust, eyes darting between Lenora and the roan mare standing like a painted promise behind her. Then, from the painted valley, the first hoofbeats echoed soft, rolling, growing louder as if the ground itself had chosen a side. The officer's head snapped around. His horse danced under him, nervous. They come, Elin whispered. Lenora's pulse steadied. She laid a hand on the fence post, its splintered wood rough against her palm. Let them see. Let them remember. The riders crested the far ridge. Sea of motion and mane, Mustangs with their wild eyes flashing, Pawnee warriors astride them like the wind itself had grown a spine and a spear. Takala rode at the front, his chest wrapped in fresh white linen, his hair loose and flying behind him like a war banner. The officer barked orders, but his men shifted back. Even Bill Renner dropped his rifle to his hip, eyes wide at the sight of 100 horses rolling like a river through the sage. Pritchard sat tall in his saddle. Easy, boys, he called to the Bitter Ridge men. These are neighbors, not enemies. Takala brought his Mustang to a stop on the other side of Lenora's fence line. He looked at her, eyes crinkling with the ghost of a smile. You stand, he said, so we ride. Lenora let out a breath that felt like it had waited years to be spoken. I do not stand alone. Takala turned to the line of soldiers, his voice carrying clear over the wind. Take your threats. Take your fires. Take your fear. They do not belong here. The Mustang shifted behind him, hooves pounding in slow, rolling thunder. The wind caught the feathers braided into Elin's hair. Bear and Crow planted themselves like old oaks, unmovable. The officer looked at Pritchard, then at the men beside him, ranchers and drifters who had no stomach for a river of hooves. Slowly, one by one, they lowered their rifles. The roan mare snorted beside Lenora, a sound that felt like laughter. Pritchard raised his chin. Miss Sinclair, this fence line holds today. But you know how men are. They'll come back. Lenora smiled, a fierce thing that showed every scar she carried. Then they'll find us here. The wind rushed through the painted valley, carrying the hoofbeats of a promise made good. Land remembers. So do the people who stand for it. And the last fence line held. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The moon rose fat and red over the painted valley that night, staining the desert in a wash of rust and fire. Lenora Sinclair sat cross-legged on the old porch, her back pressed against the roan mare's warm flank. She had taken to sleeping. Here more nights than not, the cabin walls feeling too close, too filled with the ghosts of everything she had lost and everything she had decided to keep. Beside her, Elin sat sharpening a broad-headed spear. His motions were slow, deliberate. Sparks danced now and then from the edge of the stone, falling into the dusty boards where they winked out before they could catch. Bear and Crow patrolled the yard, dark shapes weaving between fence posts like restless spirits. Bluebird lay curled. Up inside, her soft singing drifting through the cracked window, a lullaby that belonged to a mother she could barely remember. Lenora heard it and thought of her own mother's voice, buried now beneath years of dust and the scrape of other people's hate. When she closed her eyes, she saw the line of riders backing away that morning, saw the way Marshal Pritchard had. Stared at her, half sorrow, half wonder. This fence line holds today. She wondered how many tomorrows they could steal before Bitter Ridge or Fort Kestrel, or some distant man with a pen decided the ledger was due. You could go, she murmured to Elin, her voice soft enough that only the wind might hear it. Take the girl, take them all. There's land west where no one cares what blood you carry. Elin's knife paused against the spear shaft. He did not look at her when he spoke. There is no land that forgets. We carry the story, no matter how far we walk. She opened her eyes, tilting her head to see him better. And if the story ends here, he met her gaze then, his eyes dark and patient. Then it ends standing. A log cracked in the fire. Pit near the well, sending a spray of embers spinning into the night. Bear's voice drifted across the yard, low and even as a coyote's hum. Riders, coming. Lenora rose, the Winchester already resting easy in her hands. The roan stepped forward, ears flicking toward the distant sound of hooves on hardpan. Elin rose too, the spear balanced in his grip. They waited together, the four of them framed by the flickering fire and the blood moon that painted the world in bruises. The hoofbeats grew louder, steady, measured, not the frantic gallop of raiders or the rolling thunder of the Pawnee's Mustang herd. When the shapes finally emerged, Lenora's breath caught. 6 men on horseback, their coats long and dusty. Hats pulled low, faces hidden by the shadows of the night. At their head rode a figure she knew before she ever saw the gleam of the tarnished badge pinned to his chest. Pritchard. He reined up just beyond the fence, his horse tossing its head. As the roan snorted and stamped, the two animals stared at each other like rival ghosts. Miss Sinclair, Pritchard called, voice roughened by miles and more regrets than any one man should carry. I told you that line would hold today, but today's already gone. She stepped closer to the fence, careful to keep the rail between them. You come to break it, Marshal? Pritchard's eyes flicked to Elin and Bear, to Crow standing half hidden by the corner of the barn. I come to warn you. Word's gone up the chain. They're bringing more than farmers next time. Cavalry from Fort Martin, maybe more. Bear growled low in his chest. Let them come. They'll find our spears ready. Pritchard shook his head. It won't be a dozen riders and scared ranch hands. It'll be soldiers with Gatlings and orders signed by men you'll never meet. Lenora felt the wind shift, cool and heavy as a blanket soaked in storm. Why tell me? She asked, truly wanting to know. Pritchard's shoulders sagged. Because I've spent too many years watching good folks break for men who never bleed. Themselves, you stand when they all bowed their heads. Makes a man remember what a spine feels like. He leaned forward in his saddle, eyes catching the moonlight. They want your horses. They want your land. And they want him. He jerked his chin at Elin. Him and every kin he's got left. They won't stop, but you know that already. Lenora gripped the fence post, splinters biting her palm. So, you want me to run, roll over? Which is it, Marshal? Pritchard's laugh was bitter and soft. I want you to remember the blood moon when they come, so you know who's worth dying. For Bear stepped up beside her, Crow on the other side, Elin flanking her like a shadow that learned how to breathe. The roan tossed its mane, the sound like thunder trapped in a single throat. Lenora raised her chin. "Tell your superiors they'll find nothing here worth stealing. Only something worth defending." Pritchard's gaze flicked across her face, taking in the lines that sun and worry had carved, the scars she'd stopped hiding. "I'll tell him, but they won't listen." He turned his horse, the others wheeling with him. As they vanished into the dark, the wind carried his final words like a ghost. "Some fences never fall. Some folks never bend." Lenora looked at Elin, the roan, the painted faces of the men who had chosen to stay. Overhead the blood moon shone down, a sign, a warning, a promise. "I do not stand alone," she said, her voice steady as the heartbeat pounding in her ears. Elin lifted his spear. Bear grunted agreement. Crow's blade flashed in the firelight. When the wind rose, the roan stepped forward, ears pinned, nostrils flared. In the painted valley, the distant rumble of hooves answered, a reminder that even under a blood moon, the fence line would hold, and they would stand. If this ride moves you, drop a and subscribe. The next storm waits just beyond the ridge. A cold mist rolled in from the painted valley as dawn broke on a land that refused to lie quiet. Lenora Sinclair stood at the edge of her porch, the roan mare tethered close, its flanks steaming in the chill that clung to the sage and dry grass. Each breath felt heavy, as if the wind carried not just the promise of another day, but the burden of 1,000 broken ones behind it. Inside the cabin, Bluebird stirred by the hearth, her thin blanket draped over her like a memory of warmth. Elin sat by the door, spear across his knees, his eyes sharp and sleepless. Bear and Crow were out walking the fence line, again checking the rails, reading the ground for prints that never really disappeared. In the painted valley, the Mustangs moved like ghosts among the low rises, their breath plumes drifting through the dawn mist. Lenora ran her palm along the porch rail, tracing the grain worn smooth by years and storms and the slow, steady passage of hope. She could feel the storm brewing behind the hush, the way the silence always does, just before men and bullets rip it apart. She thought of Pritchard's warning under the blood moon. "They'll bring more than rifles next time." The name Fort Martin tasted like iron on her tongue, a place she'd never seen but had come to hate all the same. She pictured the neat rows of tents, the polished boots, the maps drawn by men who had never seen the wind tear across the painted valley. "You should eat something," Elin said. He rose, his spear balanced like an extension of his arm. Lenora shook her head. "When they come, there won't be time for hunger." He didn't argue. Instead, he stepped to the porch rail and leaned on it beside her, his dark hair still damp. "From the morning mist, they will come, but so will we." Lenora's mouth curved, not quite a smile but close enough for Elin to see the ghost of one. "I know." From the fence line, Bear's low whistle cut through the hush. Crow appeared out of the mist behind him, walking backward, one hand raised in signal. Lenora's fingers found the Winchester resting against the porch post. She lifted, it working the lever by feel alone. "Riders?" she asked when Bear stepped into the yard. Bear nodded. "3, not soldiers. Not Bitter Ridge. They ride like men with something worth trading." Lenora narrowed her eyes toward the shape forming in the mist, a single file of riders moving slow, the creak of leather and the occasional cough of a tired horse, the only sounds that made them real. Elin stepped off the porch first. "Stay back," he said over his shoulder. Lenora snorted softly. "You can order me to stay put when this fence line walks away on its own." The riders pulled up just beyond the gate. The one in front, a tall, raw-boned man in a battered hat, lifted his hands to show they were empty. The others flanked him, faces hidden behind scarves pulled high against the cold. "Miss Sinclair?" the man called, his voice rough but not cruel. "Name's Braddock. We come trading," Bear grunted. "Ain't nothing here worth trading for but bullets." Braddock laughed, a dry, rasping sound that might have been a cough in disguise. Then, maybe you ain't been paying attention. Word spread. You sheltered Pawnee. Stood your ground when Bitter Ridge wanted your land. There's folks out there hungry for that kind of stand. Lenora lowered the rifle, though she didn't sling it away. What kind of folks? Braddock gestured to the men behind him. Riders, drifters, settlers who got burned by the same men riding out of Fort Martin now. Not looking for charity. Miss Sinclair, looking for a line to stand behind. And someone to stand with. Elin watched them, eyes hard. You'd fight? Braddock's grin was a thin, cracked thing. Already been fighting. Just been fighting alone. Lenora stepped closer, the roan bumping her shoulder like a question waiting for an answer. You. Ride under any banner, Braddock? Any flag that tells you who deserves a bullet and who don't? Braddock shook his head. No flag but the wind. No law but the line we draw together. She looked at Bear, then Crow, then Elin, whose face betrayed. No sign of surprise or doubt. Bluebird had come to the doorway, a scrap of bread in her hand, her eyes wide as the sky beyond the painted valley. Why here? Lenora asked. Why now? Braddock leaned forward in his saddle. Because word is when the cavalry comes, they won't find you alone. Because some stories ought to outlive the men who try to bury them. Because every man and woman back there, he jerked his thumb over his shoulder at the shadows waiting in the mist, knows the only fence worth dying for is the one that means something. Silence fell. The roan snorted. The Mustangs in the valley shifted, their hoofbeats a low drum under the land. Lenora's fingers tightened on the Winchester's stock. All right then, she said, her voice clear as dawn. But understand this, we stand or we fall. There's no running. From this line. Braddock's smile, when it came, looked like hope wearing a scar. We ain't come this far to run now. She stepped aside and gestured them through the gate. Braddock and his men led their horses into the yard where Bluebird watched them. With eyes too old for her years. Elin touched Lenora's shoulder, a promise passing from his palm to her bones dot in the painted valley. The herd lifted their heads as one. The wind carried the taste of rain, but under it, the hush carried something stronger. The steady low thunder of hoofbeats coming closer, not a promise of war. Not yet, but when dawn cracked fully open, they would be ready, they would stand, and this fence line would hold. If you're still riding with this tale, drop a and subscribe. The next storm rolls in with the dawn. The rain came before dawn, soft and steady at first, drumming on the roof of Lenora Sinclair's cabin like 1,000 small hoofbeats made of water. She stood by the window, watching the drops slide down the glass in crooked lines. The roan. Mare dozed under the lean-to beside the barn, head low, tail flicking at ghosts only it could see dot behind her. The cabin breathed with the soft sounds of people sleeping. Bluebird curled up on a pile of blankets by the hearth, Elin half sitting. Near the door, his spear propped within reach. Braddock's riders, half of them strangers just yesterday, lay stretched on the floorboards, bedrolls like little islands of warmth scattered across a sea of battered boots and muddy coats. Crow and Bear hadn't come inside all night. From time to time, Lenora glimpsed them through the window, two silhouettes pacing the fence line, moving between posts like shadows stitched to the land itself. She turned from the window and picked up her father's old oil lamp. The glass was cracked near the base, a thin line that threatened to split wide every time she lit it. She touched the crack, tracing its edge. Some things hold longer than they should, she thought, because they have to. She didn't bother to wake Elin when she slipped out onto the porch. The rain soaked her hair in moments, dripping from her collar down her back. She stepped into the yard and found Bear at the western fence line, staring at the road that twisted toward Fort Martin like a snake waiting to strike. Any sign? She asked. Bear didn't look at her, only nodded once. Wagons, covered. Heavy with supplies. Cavalry won't be far behind. Lenora pushed wet hair from her eyes. How many? More than we have bullets for, she snorted softly. Good thing bullets ain't the only thing we have. Bear's teeth flashed in the dark, a grin as rough and honest as a wolf's. No, we have wind. And wind carries. No masters. She turned to look back at the yard. Even in the misty dawn, she could see the Mustangs drifting along the painted valley's edge, restless and wide-eyed. Somewhere out there, Takala and his riders waited, unseen but never far. She felt their promise in every gust that rattled the corral gate. When she went back inside, Elin was awake, his dark eyes fixed on the door before she crossed the threshold. He rose, pushing a blanket off his shoulders, spear in hand. It is time? Lenora shook her head. Not yet. But close. Braddock stirred by the stove, rolling stiffly to sit upright. His hair stuck out in damp tufts. Bad news? The only kind worth hearing, Lenora said. She stoked the stove, feeding it sticks of broken mesquite until the fire cracked. Sharp and bright. We hold the line, no matter what comes. Braddock grunted. My boys are ready. Hell, half of them been ready since they were old enough to stand. They just forgot for a while. Elin knelt beside Bluebird, brushing her hair back as she blinked awake. Her eyes went first to Lenora, then to the window. It's raining, she whispered, her voice raw from sleep. Lenora knelt beside her. Good. Rain keeps the earth soft. Makes hoofbeats hard to track. Bluebird's small fingers closed around Lenora's. Will they come today? Lenora squeezed her hand. Maybe, or tomorrow. Or the day after. But when they do, they'll find us ready. Outside, the rain thickened to a steady pour, turning the yard to mud and painting the fence posts in dark streaks. Bear and Crow worked without pause, driving new rails, tying off loose wire with the calm precision of men who understood that every handspan of land had already been paid for in blood. Braddock's riders formed a loose circle near the barn, stripping old saddles for the iron, hammering new blades from what they found. One man, a boy really no older than Elin, sat cross-legged with a handful of bullets, carving tiny symbols into each one. Protection, hope, maybe nothing at all, but it made his hand steady and his heart quiet. By mid-morning, Takala appeared. At the gate, he rode alone, rain dripping from his hair, his chest still bound in linen but his eyes clear and sharp. He dismounted without a word and walked the fence line with Lenora, stopping at each post as if listening for its story. You have enough? He asked when they reached the far corner where the fence met the creek bed. Enough for what? Lenora asked back. Takala's lips curved, a smile that was both pride and warning. Enough to remind them that this wind does not belong to men with papers and pens. She laughed short, fierce, the sound surprising them both. Then yes, I reckon we do. He touched her shoulder. When the sun breaks the storm we ride, but today we wait. She watched him go back to his horse, the painted Mustang that flicked its tail at the rain, as if daring the clouds to do worse. As Takala vanished back into the painted valley, Lenora felt the ground tremble under her boots. She knew what it was, a promise coming due. When night fell again, the rain eased into a cold mist. She sat on her porch with Elin at her side, the roan mare standing guard behind them, ears flicking at every whisper in the dark. You still think we could run? Elin asked. Lenora smiled. No, not anymore. He leaned his spear against the rail. Good, because the wind carries no masters. She reached out, laying her hand on his. No, it doesn't. In the painted valley, the Mustangs shifted, their hooves stirring the mud. The rain washed the tracks away almost as soon as they were made. Somewhere beyond the dark, the wagons from Fort Martin rattled closer, carrying their orders and their fear, but the fence line would hold. The wind would carry no masters. And when dawn broke, they would stand together. No matter what came. If you're standing here at the fence with Lenora, drop a and subscribe. Tomorrow we ride into the storm together. Before dawn, the mist clung to Bitter Ridge like a shroud. Lenora Sinclair could taste the iron of it on her lips as she walked the fence line for the 100th time. Boots sinking into mud churned by restless horses, and the shuffle of men too. Stubborn to sleep, behind her, the cabin glowed like an ember in the dark. Bluebird's small figure moved inside, stoking the hearth to life. Braddock's riders huddled under tarps stretched between fence posts, their breath steaming in the cold. Crow crouched on the fence corner, blade balanced across his knees, his eyes slits against the wind. Bear walked the far perimeter alone, his silhouette a slow heartbeat against the pale horizon. The roan mare trailed Lenora step for step, tail flicking water from its flanks. Somewhere in the painted valley, the Mustangs waited an unseen promise, hooves shifting like thunder too patient to break just yet. Lenora paused at the old corner post where her father had carved a single word. Years ago, enough, she pressed, her palm against the splintered wood, feeling the ghost of that word beneath her glove. The fence had never been about keeping things out. It was about holding fast when the world said let go. You should rest. Elan's voice drifted through the damp. He appeared beside her, spear in hand, eyes sharp despite the weariness that dragged at his shoulders. Lenora shrugged. We rest when they turn back, not before. He touched the post, tracing the same letters she had. They won't turn back. She looked past him to the road snaking down from Fort Martin. In the gray light, she saw the shapes moving wagons. Riders, the glint of metal under oilskins. A slow wave of men who believed a paper order could tame the wind. Braddock joined them at the fence line, his coat soaked through, hat pulled low. He carried his old revolver like a talisman, the barrel rubbed shiny by years of being held too tight. Pritchard sent word, he said. Marshall's trying to talk sense to the colonel riding point, but you know how that ends. Lenora snorted. I do. Bear arrived then, boots caked in mud, eyes dark with knowing. They'll be here by first light, she nodded. Then we stand. Braddock grinned. A cracked thing but real enough. Ain't that what we came for? A hush settled. Over them, a silence so deep it felt like the earth itself held its breath. Then, from the far rise where the road bent around the last outcrop of black rock, came the sound they'd waited for. The creak of wagons, the rattle of tack, the low murmur of men trying to sound braver than they felt. Elan's spear shifted. In his hand. Bear unbuttoned his coat, freeing the knife at his belt. Crow stood without a word, blade flashing once in the dawn light. Lenora stepped forward, boots squelching in the churned mud, and laid her hand on the roan's flank. The mare stood calm, ears pricked, eyes fixed on the approaching line of soldiers and wagons. Braddock, Lenora said, get your boys spread out along the fence. No shooting until they cross. Braddock nodded, spitting into the mud. We ain't the ones looking for a fight, but we'll damn well finish one. He strode off, barking orders to men who rose from bedrolls like ghosts given new bones. The fence line came alive with motion, the scrape of boots, the soft click of hammers pulled back, the whisper of prayers said to no god in particular. Lenora turned to Elan. When it breaks, get Bluebird to the corral. If the fence falls, we run for the valley. He didn't argue, just set his feet and looked at her, the boy's old eyes catching the first line of sun that crested the black ridge. When it breaks, we stand first. She almost smiled. We stand first. The wagon stopped just shy of the gate, wheels half buried in the sucking mud. Horses stamped and snorted, riders shifting uneasily under dripping cloaks. At their head, a broad-shouldered man in a crisp coat sat stiff in his saddle. His hat was dry, his boots shone. He looked like he'd never felt rain except through a window. Miss Sinclair, he called, voice carrying like cold iron. By order of the territorial authority, you will vacate these premises. The land, the livestock, and any hostiles under your roof are to be turned over to the Fort Martin detachment for relocation. Lenora felt her jaw tighten. She stepped closer to the fence, rain dripping from the brim of her hat. I don't take orders from men who've never walked this dirt. The colonel, she didn't care to know his name, tipped his chin to a man beside him. A sergeant leaned from his saddle, unrolling a paper so wet it sagged like an old flag. Sign this, the colonel said. Sign, and you can leave with what you can carry. Lenora's laugh startled even Bear beside her. It was a low, broken sound, carried more promise than threat. You ever try to fence the wind, Colonel? The man stiffened. This is your last chance, Miss Sinclair. Crow spoke then, his voice like gravel dragged across an old grave. She doesn't stand alone. From the painted valley came the first echo of hooves, a distant rumble that carried through the wet ground to their boots. The Mustangs rose over the far ridge, manes dark with rain, riders among them moving like brushfire through fog.T-K-HL bay. At their head, faces painted, spears lifted. The wind behind them, pushing them forward. The colonel barked an order. Rifles lifted. The hush cracked wide. Lenora stepped forward, one boot on the lowest rail, the Winchester braced against her shoulder. You want this land? Come and bleed for it. Bear's knife glinted at his side. Crow's blade traced a promise through the mist. Eland's spear rose like a banner of bone in storm dot, and when the hoofbeats hit the fence line, the world broke open, not into war, but into memory. Into a story that would not bend, not to papers, not to polished boots, not to the cold hunger of men who mistook dirt for gold. When dawn rose full and fierce, it found them standing mud to their knees, rain in their eyes, the wind wrapped around their shoulders like a promise never again to bow. Some fences hold, some names linger. Some stories refuse to be buried. Lenora Sinclair, the woman who sheltered a wounded Pawnee and woke the wind to carry her stand, she did not stand alone. Not now. Not ever. If you feel the thunder under your boots, drop a and subscribe. The next storm is already waiting. The sun was barely up before the first rifle cracked through the painted valley, breaking the hush like a promise betrayed. Lenora Sinclair felt it before she heard it, something in her chest tightening, as if the land itself winced at the sound. Fence line erupted in a low chorus of shouts and hoofbeats. Mud sucked at boots and hooves alike as the roan mare danced sideways, flanks steaming in the cold dawn. Lenora had one knee braced against the corner post, the Winchester leveled across the top rail. She saw the line of Fort Martin soldiers pushing forward, their polished buttons and oiled boots already filthy with the valley's stubborn clay. Braddock barked orders to his riders from the far end, his cracked voice carrying above the hiss of rain. Hold your shots. Hold 'em. But the wind was carrying more than words now. It carried the drumming thunder of Tacala's Mustangs rolling over the ridge. Manes wild, eyes wide, riders bent low like shadows stitched to the backs of dreams. Bear crouched at Lenora's side. One hand braced on the muddy rail, the other clutching his knife so tight the knuckles shone white. Crow lurked behind them, blade drawn, eyes narrowed against the wet. Eland stood just beyond the gate, spear braced against the churned earth. Bluebird huddled behind him with a bow that looked far too small to matter, but still she held it. Arrow knocked, breath misting in the cold. The first soldier to cross the fence line went down before he cleared the wire. A Pawnee rider young, face painted half white, half crimson darted through the gap, spear flashing like lightning against polished brass. The man's shout cut off sharp, swallowed by the hiss of rain and hooves. Lenora's shoulders slammed into the post as she fired, the Winchester's bark so loud it left her ears ringing. She felt the kick all the way to her teeth, saw the colonel's horse rear in the mud. The polished boots found no grip as the animal crashed sideways, pinning its rider in the sucking clay. A cry went up among the Fort Martin line, but fear is a faster horse than orders. Some dropped to one knee, firing blind through the rain. Others turned, boots sliding as they tried to outrun the Mustangs cresting the ridge. Braddock's riders surged out from the fence corners, rifles popping like firecrackers on a dry August night. One of the Bitter Ridge boys, a kid Lenora only knew as Reed, took a round high in the shoulder. He went down screaming, boots drumming in the churned muck. Braddock grabbed him by the collar, dragging him back toward the barn even as bullets hissed over their heads. Lenora reloaded, fingers slick with rain and blood she wasn't sure was hers. Bear's growl cut through her focus. She turned just in time to see Crow leap the rail like a coyote, his blade catching the sun as it broke through the mist for the briefest heartbeat. The soldier he met went down in silence, the man's rifle clattering uselessly in the mud. Elin stood his ground at the gate. A rider lunged at him, uniform torn, eyes wild with the kind of terror that makes men forget how to beg. Elin's spear caught him low in the chest, driving him back so hard he hit the fence post with a crack that split bone and wood together. Bluebird loosed her arrow then, just one, but it found a man's thigh with a thud that made Lenora wince. Even as her lips curled around a snarl, the Mustangs hit the line full force, riders whooping, painted faces alive with the promise of blood and something older than any fort or fence or piece of parchment signed by a governor who'd never seen this dust. Takala rode at the head, his chest still bound in linen, the spear in his hand dark with the storm's chill. He locked eyes with Lenora as he thundered past. "Hold!" he shouted, his voice slicing through gunfire and screams. "The wind carries. No masters." She almost laughed, almost. Instead, she found another bullet, worked the lever, and fired again. The Winchester bucked, her shoulder flaring with a pain that made her teeth grind. But the fence line held, post by post, rail by rail, man by man. Minutes stretched like years in the rain. Mud rose to their ankles, then to their knees. Horses screamed and rifles cracked until the smoke curled around them like an old ghost. The Fort Martin line buckled, men staggering back through the mire, boots dragging, eyes wide at the sight of painted riders weaving through this storm. Bear was there when one soldier lunged at Lenora, bayonet flashing. Bear's knife found the man's ribs before the steel could find her throat. The soldier gasped, eyes wide, and fell face first into the muck. Bear didn't pause, didn't even look back. He pressed one hand to Lenora's shoulder steady, certain, then moved on to the next shadow in the rain. Behind the fence, Bluebird knelt in the churned earth, her bow forgotten. She pressed her small hands to a man's chest, Reed, the boy who'd come with Braddock. His breath rattled in his throat. Lenora wanted to reach him, wanted to help. But the wind howled in her ears, full of hoofbeats and old stories, and the sharp taste of blood. When the last of the soldiers broke and ran, the valley fell quiet again. The Mustangs circled wide, riders guiding them back behind the line. Takala sat tall in his saddle, hair plastered to his face, eyes dark and bright all at once. Braddock limped up to the fence, one arm tied tight against his ribs. "They'll come again," he said. "Not today, but soon." Lenora looked at him, then at Elin, who leaned against the gatepost, spear dripping red into the mud. "We stand," she said, her voice raw but steady. Takala raised his spear, pointing it toward the painted horizon where the sun cracked the storm clouds apart. "The wind carries no masters. And neither do we." Bear and Crow pressed shoulder to shoulder at her back. The roan mare snorted, ears flicking forward, eyes fixed on the road that snaked back toward Fort Martin. Bluebird looked up from the boy she couldn't save, her small face streaked with rain and tears. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. The fence line had held. The earth beneath it soaked up blood and rain together, feeding the roots of a story too stubborn to die. Lenora rested her hand on the old post. Enough, it read. And for now just. For this dawn maybe it was. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications. When the rain finally gave up its claim on Bitter Ridge, dawn came pale and raw, as if the sun itself was too ashamed to rise high over what had been done. Lenora Sinclair stood at the broken fence line, boots half buried in the churned mud that held hoofprints, blood, and the pieces of men's promises alike. She held the Winchester across her shoulders, one hand resting on the stock as if to remind herself it was still there, still hers. The roan-mare dozed just beyond the gate, its flanks streaked with mud and sweat dried to salt. Near the barn, Braddock's men worked in a hush gathering what was left of their wounded, stacking spent rifles like firewood that had burned too hot to hold again. Elin sat cross-legged by the corral fence, spear across his knees, eyes closed. He hadn't spoken much since the last rider fell back down the ridge. Bluebird curled at his side, head resting in the hollow where his coat draped her like a shawl too thin for the cold. Crow and Bear moved the bodies they could find to the far end of the yard, where shallow graves were marked by nothing more than a scrap of cloth or a battered hat. Doc Kala rode the line where the Mustangs grazed, weaving through the herd like a rumor made flesh. His chest was still bound, the linen now so stained it looked more earth than cloth. He hadn't come back to the yard yet. Lenora wondered if he ever would. She stepped to the corner post enough and laid her palm against it. The wood was rough, splintered by a stray bullet. Blood, dark and gummy, marked the rail where Crow had leaned when he pressed a hand to his side to keep his own insides from becoming part of the mud. How many more times? She asked herself, but the wind didn't answer. It never did. Braddock approached, his hat crumpled in his fist, coat hanging open to show a fresh bandage across his ribs. We sent a scout to Bitter Ridge. Pritchard's gone. Rode south last night. Word is Fort Martin wants his badge. Lenora lifted her chin. And what do they want with us? Braddock barked a humorless laugh. Same thing they always wanted. A reason. And a warning. He squinted out toward the road, where the wagon tracks were already half washed away by the storm. They'll come back. Better guns. More men. Maybe not tomorrow, but soon. She didn't look away. Let him come. Braddock tipped his hat forward again, rolling the battered brim between his palms. We'll need more than riders. More than Pawnee spears and a rusted fence. I know. Lenora turned to face him fully. But we have this line. And we have they. Wind. Braddock met her eyes, something tired and bright flickering in the lines around his mouth. Ain't much, is it? She looked past him where Elin still sat, unmoving. Where Crow hunched over a grave that wouldn't hold the name of the boy he'd dragged from the mud. Where Bear wiped blood from his blade with the quiet ritual of a man who'd done it too many times. No, she said, voice soft as the dawn. It's everything. The wind stirred through the yard, lifting the mane of the roan-mare. The Mustangs lifted their heads as one, ears swiveling toward the painted valley where the promise of more riders and more storms lived. Just beyond the next rise, Braddock's hand fell on her shoulder. There'll be more blood. Lenora's eyes narrowed. Then the earth will remember us when the men in polished boots forget. She stepped away from him, back toward the cabin where Bluebird had stirred awake, her small hand pressed to Elin's knee. He looked up as Lenora approached, the hollow ache in his eyes cracking just enough to let a question through. Do we stand again? He asked. Lenora crouched beside him, her boots sinking into the wet grass. She touched the spear across his lap, her fingers brushing the new notches he'd carved during the night. We stand until we can't, then we stand some more. Bluebird leaned against her shoulder, a warmth so small yet so heavy that it made Lenora's breath catch. And if they come in the night? The girl asked, her voice no louder than the wind. Then the wind will tell us, Lenora said. And we will be ready. From the painted valley came the faintest tremor of hoofbeats. Not soldiers this time, but scouts Pawnee. Riders drifting like mist through the sage, checking every ridge, every bend in the creek bed. Takala had left nothing to chance. The wind carried their promise ahead of them. Braddock's voice rose from behind her. "Fence won't hold forever." Lenora turned just enough to look at him, the ghost of a smile flickering at the corner of her mouth. "Then we hold each other." Bear and Crow joined them at the fence line. They stood shoulder to shoulder, mud and blood drying on their boots. The roan mare stepped closer, breath steaming in the weak light. Together, they looked out across the churned earth that had cost so much to hold. It would cost more. They all knew it, but the wind carried no masters. And the fence line still stood. For now that was enough. If you believe some lines are worth the cost, drop a and subscribe. The next storm is closer than you think. The sun rose slow the next morning, like it had to think twice before hauling its weight over the painted valley. Lenora Sinclair stood at the gate, her palm pressed to the splintered top rail where the word enough had all but faded under a smear of rain. Mud, and the blood of men who'd tested its meaning and come up short. The roan mare stood beside her, flanks streaked with dried sweat. Its breath puffed steady in the chill that lingered before the heat came on full. Beyond the fence, the valley stretched out like a quilt patched in sage and stone, shadows still hiding the ridges where Takala's scouts moved like wind-given bones. Behind her, the yard stirred to life. Braddock's riders moved slow but sure, tightening straps, sorting the few cartridges that hadn't been spent in the last stand. Bear squatted near the porch, sharpening his blade with the careful calm of a man who knew steel was only as good as the hand that wielded it. Crow stood at the far corner, watching the road like it owed him a debt. Inside the cabin, Bluebird's laughter rose and fell like a song half-remembered light and raw all at once. Elin sat with her, mending a torn piece of cloth that had been a flag once, now just a scrap of memory too stubborn to rot. Lenora leaned her weight into the fence, the Winchester slung over her shoulder. She listened for the hoofbeats before she saw them, low thunder rolling in from the west, where the sun hit the sage and turned it to silver. Crow's voice came low and steady from the corner post. "Riders," Braddock spat into the dirt. "More of Fort Martin's shiny bastards?" Lenora squinted into the glare. "No, these don't ride like soldiers." She could feel it in the way the earth carried the sound steady, even, but not drilled to march in lines. These were drifters. Maybe dreamers. Or the last of the broken who still believed in a fence line that cost blood to hold. When they crested the ridge, she saw them for what they were, families and loners alike. Old wagons loaded with battered trunks. Women riding mules, rifles strapped to the sides. A few boys not much older than Bluebird driving cattle that looked like they'd seen too many winters and not enough pasture. A big man rode point coat patched at the elbows, hat brim torn near the crown. He lifted a hand when he caught her eye. "Miss Sinclair?" She didn't bother to answer, just nodded once. The man pulled up short of the fence, boots creaking as he shifted in the saddle. "Name's Holt. Heard word up in Mesquite Crossing that you had a stand worth bleeding for." Braddock muttered, "What's left to bleed, is the question." Holt ignored him. "Got 3 wagons, 5 able shooters, 2 kids good with slings if you count the little ones. We ain't much, but we're yours, if you want us." Lenora looked past him at the faces peering from under the wagon tarps, eyes wide and hungry, but not for food. Hungry for something solid, something that wouldn't slip away when polished boots showed up with paper and threats. She rested her hand on the fence post. "You know what you're asking?" Holt's jaw set like iron. "I know there ain't no fence. That holds if folks keep walking away from it." A low hum of agreement rose behind her. Bear crossed the yard, boots squelching in the soft earth. "Got room for them by the barn," he said. "Plenty of sage needs clearing if they want to set stakes." Crow just nodded, his eyes never leaving the horizon. Elin stepped out from the cabin then, Bluebird clinging to his hand, her small fingers wrapped tight around 2 of his. "If they stand," Elin said, "they're ours." Lenora's throat tightened at that, something hot and painful swelling behind her ribs. She pushed it down. "All right then," she said, loud enough for every ear. "Bring your wagons through. You stand. Here, you stand for every rail, every post, every name buried in this dirt." Holt touched his hat brim. "That's all any of us ever wanted, Miss Sinclair." As they pulled through the gate, the roan mare stamped the earth and blew a snort into the dawn. Somewhere beyond the ridges, thunder rolled again, deeper this time, closer, like the sky was reminding them what it cost to keep what the wind wanted to take. Kala appeared from the far fence line, Mustang trotting under him like a shadow. With a heartbeat, he looked at the newcomers, the wagons, the children peeking from behind patched blankets. His painted face cracked into something that might have been a smile. "More stories," he said. "More thunder." Lenora leaned her shoulder into the post marked enough. The crack in the wood had widened since the last fight, sap bleeding out to stain her palm. "We hold," she said, voice steady as the hoofbeats behind her, the wind before her, and the blood under her boots. "And if they want this line, they'll pay for every rail in thunder and sage." Braddock's laugh came ragged and bright all at once. "Ain't a man alive knows how to fence the wind." Crow's knife flashed once in the rising sun, as if the wind itself had agreed. And the fence line held. "Some fences are worth more than land. Drop a if you stand here too and subscribe, so you don't miss the next storm." Night came like a shroud stitched in moonlight, draping the painted valley in silver shadows and promises nobody could keep forever. Lenora Sinclair lay stretched across the porch boards, her head propped against the roan mare's warm flank. She traced the Winchester's battered barrel with one fingertip, feeling every dent, every scrape, each a memory someone else had tried to take away from her. Beyond the yard, the Mustangs moved in the sage, manes flashing white under the moon. They drifted like ghosts between fence lines that had been mended so many times the rails looked more scar than wood. Somewhere out there, Takala's riders kept watch, drifting from ridge to creek bend with the wind at their heels. Inside the cabin, Bluebird slept beside Elin, his hand resting protectively on her narrow shoulder. Braddock snored in the corner, half sitting against the hearthstone, boots still on, hack pulled low. Bear and Crow traded watch duty by the corral gate, their silhouettes shifting like shadows learning to breathe. Lenora listened to the wind humming through the fence posts. It sounded like an old woman singing to herself, a tune too tired to remember its own words. Her eyes drifted shut, but the ache behind them stayed wide awake. How many more dawns? How many more names buried in shallow dirt and marked by fence? Rails nobody asked to bleed for. The roan nudged her shoulder, breath warm and sweet with the scent of wild oats. Lenora pressed her forehead to the animal's neck, whispering, "We'll keep it for you, girl, even when we can't keep it for ourselves." A soft shuffle on the porch steps drew her eyes open. Elin settled beside her, blanket draped over his shoulders, hair loose around his face. "You should sleep," Lenora laughed, raw and quiet. "Sleeps for folks who don't have ghosts scratching at their fence posts." He didn't answer, just reached out and pressed his palm over hers on the Winchester's stock. "They'll come at dawn." "I know," she said. "They always do." They sat like that, leaning into the roan's steady heartbeat, until Bear's voice drifted from the corral gate. "Riders!" In an instant, the yard woke. Braddock rolled to his feet, rifle in hand, his coat half buttoned. Crow vanished into the shadows at the fence line, knife glinting like a sliver of moon. Bluebird peered out the cabin door, eyes wide, Elin moving to block her with his spear braced in the dirt. Lenora rose, boots silent on the porch boards, Winchester low at her side. She stepped into the yard, mud slick under her solace, and saw them crest the far rise, half a dozen figures on horseback, painted Mustangs weaving through sagebrush like shadows on Spoling. Tuffala rode at their head, face painted with new lines. Of red and white, he lifted his hand. We come with news. Braddock spat into the dirt. Always news, never good. Takala dismounted, boots silent on the wet ground. Fort Martin has scouts on the creek bend. They count the herd, they mark the fences. They say they will come at dawn to drive us off this land for good. Lenora's grip on the Winchester tightened until her knuckles ached. They always say. Takala tilted his head, eyes catching the moonlight like a hawk's. But they do not know what the Mustangs know. She arched a brow. And what's that? He looked past her, to the roan mare standing at the fence gate, ears pricked forward. That no. Man owns what runs free, and some things cannot be fenced. Braddock stepped closer, voice rough. You mean to run? Takala's smile was like a crack in stone. No, I mean to let them chase what they cannot catch. The herd will move tonight deep into the valley, away from the lines they think they own. We ride with them. Bear crossed his arms. You leave. U.S. here to bleed alone? Takala shook his head. We leave you the wind and the fence. They will chase shadows while the last Mustangs run free. And when they find nothing but empty rails and cold fire pits, they will learn. Crow's low chuckle drifted from the dark. Men like that don't learn. Takala met Lenora's gaze, and she felt the truth of it settle in her bones like an old wound. They do not need to. The wind will remember for them. The roan mare stamped the dirt, breath steaming in the chill. Bluebird stepped from the cabin, her bare feet silent in the wet grass. Will they come here? Lenora bent and lifted her. Into her arms, the girl's small weight pressing every scar deeper into her chest. They might, but they'll find a fence line waiting. And if they cross it, they'll pay for every post. Bear growled. Braddock lifted his rifle, sighting down the barrel at the empty road. And we'll send them home with thunder at their heels. Ethan laid his spear across his shoulder, eyes finding Lenora's. The wind carries no masters. She kissed Bluebird's temple, then set her down, and neither do we. Takala swung back onto his Mustang, the others mounting beside him. When the last Mustangs run free, so will this valley. No paper or polished boot will hold it. Only your bones and the wind. Lenora stepped to the fence, resting one palm on the rail marked enough. Then let the wind remember us. The riders vanished into the sage, hoofbeats swallowed by the hush. The herd followed Maney's tossing, hooves drumming like distant thunder. Carrying stories no man could claim. When the sun rose, the fences would stand empty. The scouts would find rails, but no herd, no warriors, no easy trophies to show their polished boots. But they would find Lenora Sinclair boots sunk deep in mud and memory, the Winchester warm in her hands, the roan mare flicking its tail like a promise not yet broken, and the fence line would hold Dot for as long as the last Mustangs ran free. 2 more stories wait just beyond this ridge. Subscribe and turn on notifications. This wind never rests. Dawn came restless and red, creeping over the painted valley like a cut that refused to close. Lenora Sinclair stood at the far fence line, boots sunk ankle-deep in the churned earth where the last fight had bled itself dry, the rail under her. Palm was rough with splinters. Enough. The word carved there might have faded, but the promise never did. Behind her, the yard stirred to life. Braddock's riders were already moving, shoulders hunched, rifles cradled like children they never got to raise. Crow knelt by the cabin door, cleaning his blade with a scrap of cloth that used to be someone's shirt. Bear crouched by the old well, the grind of his whetstone against steel ringing through the hush like a hammer tapping out a heartbeat. The roan mare paced the fence near Lenora, nostrils flaring at the scent drifting on the wind smoke. Not the kind that warms a hearth or sears a meal gone wrong. This was the black-bellied smoke of men trying to scare the land into submission. Beyond the rise, Fort Martin's fires clawed at the sky, devouring dry brush to push the Mustangs deeper into the valley. But Takawa's herd was already gone, hooves carrying them where no polished boot could follow. Elin stepped to Lenora's side, spear balanced across his shoulders. His eyes were sunken but clear. They're burning what they can't own. Lenora snorted. Let em. Fire feeds the roots deeper. Braddock joined them at the gate, hat pulled low over his battered face. Scouts say they're gathering at the creek bend. 100 rifles, maybe more, Bear grunted. Then the wind's got work to do. Bluebird peeked from the cabin door, the hem of Elin's old coat dragging the porch boards. She clutched a strip of fabric between her small fingers, the cloth. So worn it barely held the pattern of the Pawnee paint she'd asked Takala for before he rode with the herd. Do we run? She asked. Lenora turned from the fence, one boot propped on the bottom rail. She looked at Braddock's men farmers, drifters, boys who used to know only hunger and hard beds. She looked at Bear and Crow, their shadows long against the morning sun. She looked at Elin, who had learned to stand with her when everything else said kneel. No, she said, voice soft but cutting clean through the hush. We stand. Crow rose, blade tucked into his belt. Then we stand here. Smoke drifted over the fence line, carrying the hiss of flames eating sage. The roan mare snorted, eyes rolling. As the wind shifted, Lenora pressed her palm to its neck, feeling the tremor in its skin. Braddock spat into the dirt. They'll come with more than fire next time, Gatlings maybe. I heard they got a cannon wagon from Carson City. Bear's laugh was a low rumble. Let 'em drag that iron beast through this mud. The valley eats iron the same way it eats bones. Elin brushed Bluebird's hair back, murmuring in words she would carry long after this fence fell to splinters in memory. Lenora watched him, feeling the weight of it all settle in her ribs. The wind shifted, pushing the smoke south. From the ridge, riders appeared, Fort Martin scouts, pale faces under wide hats, rifles slung low. They didn't come closer, not yet. Just watched, counted, measured rails and shoulders like they were counting bushels to burn. Lenora stepped onto the bottom rail, boots steady in the mud. She lifted the Winchester, resting it easy on her shoulder. You reckon they see what they came for? Braddock asked. She didn't take her eyes off the scouts. They see the fence. They see we're still here. That's enough. Crow's blade flashed as he turned back toward the cabin. Bear tossed his whetstone into the dirt and picked up the battered axe leaning by the well. Braddock checked the cylinder of his revolver, thumb brushing each round like a rosary he never learned to pray. The roan mare bumped Lenora's shoulder, its warm breath grounding her in the hush before the storm. She leaned her cheek into its mane, the scent of smoke and sweat, a balm she didn't know she'd needed. Beyond the scouts, the fire moved like a hungry ghost, but the Mustangs were gone. No herd left to claim. No trophies to drag back to Fort Martin's polished halls. All that remained was a line of battered fence, a handful of stubborn souls, and the wind that refused to bow. Elin stepped beside her. Bluebird pressed to his side. When they come, we meet them here. Lenora dropped her boots to the dirt, the Winchester steady in her grip. When they come, they'll find fire waiting for fire. Braddock barked a laugh, but his eyes stayed on the scouts. They'll learn what happens when you try to fence the wind. Bear's voice rumbled from the yard. And they'll bleed for every rail. Crow's low whisper cut the hush like a blade. Some fences hold, some never burn. Lenora touched the post, splinters biting her palm. She felt every name carved there, real or not. Every promise that the wind had carried and the earth had. Buried deep, when the first shot came, the roan mare didn't flinch. Neither did she. The fence held Dot and the wind carried their story through the fire. If you're still standing at this fence line, drop a and subscribe. One more storm yet to come. The sun climbed slow that final morning, as if the sky itself was reluctant to give Fort Martin's men a clear shot. The valley lay hushed beneath it, painted in long stripes of gold and ash, the sage still wet from the storm that had carried Takawa's herd far beyond the scouts' reach. The fence line stood battered but unbroken, rails patched with rope and sweat and promises that cost more than any ledger could reckon. Lenora Sinclair stood at the gate, her boots sunk so deep. In the churned mud she felt more post than flesh. The Winchester rested across her back, the barrel worn silver where her palm always found it. Beside her, the roan mare stamped its hoof, breath misting in the chill that would burn off before noon. She ran her hand along its warm neck, thinking of the Mustangs now a ghost herd somewhere west of the Bitter Ridge Free. Like this line would never be. Behind her, the yard stirred to life one last time. Braddock's boys, no longer boys, checked cartridges, blades, and the tightness of knots in their coats. Crow crouched at the far corner, eyes slitted against the glare. His blade balanced across his knees like a prayer he'd never speak aloud. Bear rolled his shoulders as he hefted the old axe, the edge freshly ground and cruelly bright in the dawn. Inside the cabin, Bluebird woke slow under the patchwork blanket that had been her mother's one-stories woven through every frayed seam. Elin crouched beside her, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that steamed between them like a campfire of secrets they never spoke aloud. When they stepped out, the yard fell quiet. Crow rose, Bear lowered the axe to his side, and Braddock lifted his hat in a silent nod. The roan flicked its tail, ears pinned forward. All of them turned their eyes to the road snaking out of Fort Martin, still empty in the hush, but that wouldn't last. "Scouts say they're massing behind the creek bend," Braddock said. His voice cracked like old leather. Gatlings on wagons, cavalry mounts shod for mud. Lenora didn't look at him, let him come. He laughed one bark, cut short by the morning hush. "I ever tell you I hate dying before breakfast?" Bear's growl rumbled out. "Then stand behind me, Braddock." The line of them moved to the fence. Elin helped Bluebird up onto the lowest rail, her tiny boots balanced on the rough wood, arms braced around the old post where enough had been carved so many seasons ago. She laid her cheek against the splintered word and closed her eyes. "If they break us?" Braddock asked low. Lenora turned her head, hair catching the sun that had finally decided to show its whole face. "Then they break us standing." Crow's blade flashed once. "Better that than kneeling." Bear leaned close to Elin, pressing the axe into his palm. "When it's done, you get her clear," he said, nodding to Bluebird. "Run west. Follow the herd." Elin didn't answer. He just squeezed Bear's wrist, the way men do when they both know the odds and don't have to say them out loud. The first thunder rolled over the ridge, not the skies, but horses, boots, iron-shod wheels rattling over stone and creek. Fort Martin's line came into view, rows of men in dull blue, the gleam of rifle barrels catching the sunrise. Behind them, the wagons trundled forward low-slung beasts with gatlings mounted like iron vipers waiting to spit lead. Braddock muttered, a curse that had no name. Crow shifted his stance. Bear bared his teeth. Bluebird opened her eyes and whispered, "Mama said wind carries no masters." Lenora smiled, a ragged thing that tasted like gunpowder on her tongue. "Your mama was right." The roanmar danced at her, sighed, eyes rolling white. Beyond the fence, the line of soldiers halted an officer riding forward under a white flag he didn't deserve. "Miss Sinclair," he called, "one last chance. Lay down your arms. Turn over the land, the livestock." Braddock's shot cut him short. The white flag snapped in the wind, half torn by the bullet's passage. The officer reeled in his saddle, clutching his hat, face gone pale as sun-bleached bone. Lenora lifted her Winchester, voice carrying clear as a bell through the hush that followed. "This line holds. And if you cross it, the wind will carry your names as ghosts who learned too late." The officer spat in the dirt and wheeled his horse around. One barked order snapped the line taut. Rifles lowered, hammers cocked. The gatlings clanked into place, Braddock lifted his revolver. Crow raised his blade. Bear braced his feet. Eland's spear found the earth at Bluebird's side. The roan stamped the mud and shrieked once into the dawn. The first volley came like hailstones. Fired from hell bullets, chewing fence rails, smashing posts, tearing cloth from shoulders and sleeves. Smoke rolled in plumes, thick and bitter. Lenora fired, the Winchester bucking her shoulder raw. Crow darted along the line like a fox, blade flashing, his low grunt carrying over the screams. Bear's axe rose and fell, a steel pendulum marking. Every heartbeat with bone and mud dot, they pushed the first rank back once, then twice, but the Gatlings roared to life, spinning death across the yard in arcs that cut the air to ribbons. Braddock staggered under the rail, a crimson bloom flowering across his coat. He fell laughing, teeth pink with blood, boots still braced in the mud he'd come here to die in. Eland ripped the axe free of a post where it had lodged, swinging it over Bluebird's head as a rider cleared the fence. The blade met bone. The rider screamed. The roan slammed its hooves into another, sending him sprawling into the churned dirt where Bear's knife found his throat. Lenora tasted blood at the corner of her mouth, the tang of it bright as the sun burning through the gun smoke. She fired, worked a lever, fired again. Each shot a promise, for the land, for the Mustangs, now a rumor on the western horizon, for every fence rail driven by calloused hands who knew what enough meant. When the Gatlings fell silent, jammed or dry, it didn't matter. Fort Martin's line wavered. Lenora felt it before she saw it, the hesitation, the backward glance. She pushed forward, boots slogging through blood and mud, voice cracking as she shouted over the wind that rose behind them. "This line holds." Crow leapt the fence, blade buried to the hilt in a sergeant's gut. Bear tackled two more before a bullet caught him low. He stumbled, roaring, swinging the axe one last time before he dropped to his knees in the dirt he'd promised to keep. Bluebird screamed. Eland scooped her in his arm, spear braced against his shoulder as he hauled her back from the fence. Lenora turned, eyes locking on him through the haze. He nodded once. She nodded back. Some promises didn't need words. The last rank of fort. Martin's line broke. Men scrambled for their horses, boots slipping in the churned earth, leaving rifles stuck, barrel first in the muck like tombstones with no names. Lenora pressed her palm to the fence post one last time. Splinters bit deep. She felt every ghost in the rails, every heartbeat under the boards of the cabin, every hoofbeat of the Mustangs now a storm over the far ridge. Crow leaned against her, breath ragged, blade hanging loose in his fist. "We stand. We stand," she breathed. She turned to Bear lying still now, eyes wide to the sky. Braddock gone quiet behind the gate. Bluebird's cry fading as Eland carried her west, past the fire, past the fences, toward the wind that carried no masters. The last shots fell quiet. The valley did too. Smoke drifted off the rails like steam from a brand new scar. Lenora leaned her forehead to the post. Enough. The word was gone now, carved so deep the wood had given it back to the earth. The roan snorted beside her, flanks trembling. She turned, her face into its mane, eyes shut tight. The fence holds Dot and the wind remembered. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.